Hi, Sachsenhausen, Kolonia Gwarna, Parna, Germania richtig dicker Heil, Sachsenhausen. Wirtycie jak bambusik, trupie łebki to kaktusy heil, es lebe kule to kam.
Welcome to Descendant Stuff, a podcast by and for the descendants of Sachsenhausen prisoners, working together to uncover the unanswered questions of its history. We are Jakob, Kelsey, and Nicole, three descendants of Sachsenhausen prisoners. Today, Jakob and Nicole are here with Amelie Reichmuth, speaking about her grandfather, Klaus Reichmuth. He was born on the 24th of May in 1924 in Stettin. At the time, it was part of the German Empire. It is currently part of Poland. He died on August 16th of 2021 in Hamburg. Klaus was arrested on the 13th of January, 1942, when he was only 17 years old, in Stettin, and he was taken to the Gestapo headquarters in Berlin. From there, he was transferred to Sachsenhausen concentration camp on the 29th of March, 1942, where he was imprisoned for 6 months. He actually turned 18 while he was in the concentration camp. Amelie, thank you so much for joining us today to speak about your family history. Can you tell us a little bit about your relation to Klaus? You are first-generation descendant, second-generation descendant?
Klaus is my grandfather, so I'm the third generation. Generally speaking, in a way, the topic has always been present in the background, I would say. In a way, we always talk about it, but in a very abstract and historical way. So we were very much focused on the facts. I know for a fact that my fathers and his siblings were also very much interested in understanding what the German population at the time knew and why there weren't more people resisting and so on. But, being a third generation member, I was more at the periphery, and it's only in my young adult years that I'd really started to explore more that part of my family history and went to Sachsenhausen for the first time in 2021. So in a way, I've only been processing that part of my story for the past 4 or 5 years.
Can you tell us a little bit about what you know about your grandfather's life before he was imprisoned?
I would say that his childhood was quite common for the time. He grew up in a part of German territories, which nowadays belongs to Poland, in Stettin. It was a household in a family of reverends, so rather conservative and quite religious family. He had 3 siblings, and in that sense, it was a typical childhood. When the Nazi came to power, he followed the usual track and joined the Hitlerjugend, the youth organization. So I guess he was a child of his time.
Do you know something about his parents?
Do you know what their stance was during that time?
First of all, they were from a region in Germany that wasn't directly connected to the main territory. And it's a region back then which was extremely patriotic, not to say nationalistic. And because there was this strong connection to religion, I guess you could say they were religious conservative in every sense of the word.
Do you know anything about what they thought about the political situation of the time and the changes that were happening throughout the 30s?
One thing that might be interesting to know was the fact that when the Nazi came to power, they started to basically get into every aspect of life, including religion. So the same way they tried to suppress free media and free culture, they also tried to instrumentalize religion, and especially the church, being still an authority at the time. So within the German church, especially the Lutheran church, you basically started having two movements where you had the Nazi church on the one hand and the Free Church on the other. At first, the agreements were just as much religious as political, because the Nazis also integrated mythical elements to the Christian religion, for instance. They were very much inspired by old northern mythology. So in a way, for the true Christian, I'm saying this in quotation marks, it was a treason and it was something to stand up against before even talking about the political side of things. So the family of my grandfather was involved in that second movement within the church that later on also started actively resisting. And even after the war, my grandfather and my family kept ties to the descendants of the family of Bonhoeffer, who was a pastor who resisted, was sent to a concentration camp, and even died in 1943. In that sense, I wouldn't feel comfortable calling them resistant fighters in the traditional sense of the term, but they were part of that bigger movement within the church. But at the same time, my grandfather was in the Hitlerjugend, and while he was jailed, his brother was in the German army. So it's not like there was a clear cut in that sense.
So your grandfather grew up in a conservative Lutheran reverend family, living a conservative life. Why did he end up in concentration camp?
Actually, it's partly connected to what I was describing before. As part of this broader, let's say, spiritual and even ideological fight from the church officially opposed the so-called T4 action. So the program the Nazis started to exterminate people with disability, people who were chronically ill or had a mental illness. And to be very specific, in my grandfather's case, what happened was that he shared a copy of a sermon by a Catholic bishop, Van Galen, who did a sermon during Mass, very clearly and firmly opposing these murders, calling them out as murders. So my grandfather, distributed copies of this sermon at school and, on the street. And that was enough to be arrested together with his classmate and friend.
Did he ever talk about the arrest itself? Do you know any details about what happened that day?
He was supposed to finish school and prepare for his exam. And he was arrested there. First, he was taken and interrogated to kind of figure out, what was his motive and why he had done it, basically, and how strong of a resistant fighter he might be or not be. They also asked his classmates. They did an investigation, basically, to find out more about his character, his affiliations, engagements of all kinds, evaluate how big of a danger he was. And I think ultimately that's why he ended up only getting sent to the camp for 6 months. One thing I haven't said, because for me it's very obvious because I've heard the story, he wasn't part of any group, so it wasn't like a planned or coordinated action. It was totally spontaneous and a personal initiative, you could almost say, motivated by his religious beliefs and what stands in the Bible is that you shall not kill. I think it's a fair assumption to assume he didn't really think about the possible consequences.
Maybe he didn't know possible consequences.
Exactly.
But he wasn't arrested alone. He was arrested with a friend.
Because the friend had also done the same and shared these flyers or brochures. That's why the Nazis also had to investigate if there was any cell or group behind it, or if it was just two teenagers doing mischief, to put it very simply.
The friend was also involved in the church somehow?
They were classmates, but his family was also part of this Christian bubble, if you want to call it that way, which is why, the two boys had a strong connection.
When they have been arrested, they were sentenced to something, like from a court, or there was a judge making a decision about what's going to happen with the two boys? Or how did the story?
As far as I know, they've never been presented to a judge, and they didn't have a trial, or they didn't even have a lawyer. So in that sense, it was a bit more straightforward than that, in the sense that they were arrested, there was an inquiry, and then they were transferred. If I remember correctly, it's the Gestapo who sent him to Sachsenhausen.
He was in Berlin not just for a couple of days, but for 2 months almost.
Exactly.
And do you know anything about his time there?
And the only thing that I know is that his family tried, of course, to get him released, and obviously that did not happen.
So there wasn't a trial, but he ended up in Sachsenhausen, he and his friend. By that time, Sachsenhausen concentration camp was already working as a concentration camp for a couple of years, and the situation in the camp got worse by the time. What do you know about his time in concentration camp?
I know that the conditions were pretty harsh, that he had to work really hard physically. He was a work slave. I don't know exactly what he did, in which type of factory he worked. I guess the goal was pretty clear, educating him through forced labor, and it was really a life that was very much focused on survival. I know that what he found particularly hard, other than, of course, being imprisoned, badly treated, not seeing his friends and family, was the fact he wasn't allowed to exercise his religion. He didn't have a Bible, he didn't go to church on Sundays, so that was really hard for him. What I know was that his physical state deteriorated to the level where he at some point fainted during the appel, where the inmates had to stand for hours because they were being counted. And so he was taken to the infirmary where he stayed for quite some time. He was really in a bad shape. You would refer to him during that period as a Muselman, so an inmate who's in really, really bad condition. He actually told me that when he was in the infirmary, he had, I guess, what we nowadays call a mental breakdown, because he was very weak physically, but also mentally speaking, he basically lost hope and he didn't see any meaning with life. So he was kind of ready to give up, I guess. And that's when something quite extraordinary happened. One of the other patient or inmate kind of took him under his wing and made sure that he would get out every day to have a walk and get fresh air. He would talk to him and try to get him to be a bit more active, because he was really in a state where he wouldn't talk. He would be completely depressed. And so the inmate really did it for the days, day after day. He also remembered very fondly the nurse or the inmate who was in charge of leading the infirmary, who also made sure, he was well treated and took care of him.
Your grandfather was not even 18 when he was sent to concentration camp. Do you know if he lived in a special block for non-adults?
I don't think there were specific blocks for children or youth. At least he never mentioned them explicitly. So now I'm just guessing he was just a prisoner like anyone else in that sense.
Within the 6 months, you said he was sick, physically weak, mentally weak. So you think there was a real danger of dying or being killed?
I think it's clear that the goal was to break people, if not murder them through forced labor, by treatment, execution. I think he was lucky because he got in so young. So I assume they kind of made the calculation he can be saved within 6 months if the plan we have with his camps work. And he was privileged because obviously he was a German. So in the camp's internal hierarchy, obviously he wasn't at the bottom, quite the contrary.
Do you know if they labeled him with a category of prisoners?
That's a good question.
Probably political prisoner.
That's also my guess. I honestly don't know.
Amelie, you mentioned earlier his 18th birthday. He turned 18 while he was in Sachsenhausen. You mentioned to me earlier he has vivid memories of that day.
He was the witness of an execution. He saw how 2 men were being hanged. I don't know the details of what happened or why they were executed, but he remembered.
Were there any other stories of specific events that he ever recounted to you?
Well, there was the story I told about his time in the infirmary. I remember he also shared the story about a prisoner shared his soup with him. But other than that, nothing specific in that sense.
Have you been able to kind of uncover and learn more about Sachsenhausen and the conditions there through your research and talking with other descendants than the details that you got directly from your grandfather?
I was able to, because he was able to talk about his memories. When he got older, he actually started giving interviews, visiting schools. So in that sense, he was able to share his experience. He was even portrayed in an exhibition in Sachsenhausen a few years before his death as one of the main characters. Within that exhibition, it was specifically about Christians in Sachsenhausen who were persecuted by the Nazis because of their religious and political beliefs. So as part of that process, of course, he worked very closely with the historians, gave interviews, shared documents he still had at home, pictures, and so on. So in that sense, there is definitely archives. We have pictures from the day he came home because a family friend who was a journalist took a picture. So in a way, compared to other descendants, I have a lot. But then what really was a game changer for me was going to Sachsenhausen and being part of that symposium on the future of remembrance, because it was the first time I was there, just a few weeks after my granddad had passed away. The combination of having the program with the whole study tour almost, and doing it together as a group was really an eye-opener.
While he was in the concentration camp, do you know if he had contact with his parents? So was he allowed to write a letter?
Yes, actually, in the exhibition, I have the catalog with me as we speak. You can see copies of letters the two boys sent. But of course, since the mail was monitored, it's hard to tell how credible it is. But as I mentioned before, his family, of course, really tried to get him out of there. What they also did was that both boys were put on prayer lists. So basically, the people in the parish all prayed for them. And I'm saying it because my grandfather is convinced that it saved him and his. It was a bit hard for me to genuinely believe that he could still be so religious after his experience in the camp and even chose to become a pastor. But for him, the fact that he was saved was the confirmation he was one of the chosen ones. And he almost took it not just a blessing, but a learning, because when he was there, he told me he just felt like a wreck, an under person, Untermensch in German. But yet he was saved, he made it through, and for him it was divine intervention.
Do you know if they told him how long he would have to stay in Sachsenhausen? So did he know, after 6 months I will be released in case I survive? Or did he just had to wait until suddenly they said something or didn't say something?
Good question. I don't know, frankly. I'm just looking at I have a copy of their admission to the camp, so to say, admission paper. But I can't find any mention of the release date. So, not sure.
When he was finally released from Sachsenhausen, he was 18 years old, so still quite young. It was still 1942, war days. How did his life continue?
He voluntarily joined the army and ended the war as a regular soldier, fought on the Eastern Front, among others, and was taken as a prisoner of war, where he spent 2-3 years after the war. It's a bit hard to understand for me because it's quite quite a move to go from a concentration camp to joining the Nazi army. And I've really tried to understand what he must have thought, why he took that path. It is actually a combination of different factors, because I asked him directly and he said, well, you young people, you look at it differently, and back then we didn't think the same way as you do. We didn't ask that many questions, and in a way we were less nuanced, I guess. So the reason why he did that was a mix of, I would say, very down-to-earth pragmatic reason. He was terrified to go back to the concentration camp, and he was told that if he was to share what he had seen, he would be killed. Another reason was that his brother was actually an officer in the army, and being the younger brother, his brother was, I guess, a role model, you could say. Since the brother had been killed at the front, I guess he might have felt urged to replace him and follow his example. There are at least 2 or 3 other explanations. One is connected to the fact that he grew up, as I mentioned, in what was called then Eastern Prussia, in a very conservative milieu where there was a clear connection between German nationalism and the nostalgia of the empire, religion. And so I think this definitely played a role in his worldviews. It sounds incredible when you think about it now, but he actually said that he didn't see the connection between what happened for him in the camp and the Nazi regime and the institutions. Because of his background in this environment, the army was still a respectable institution that had nothing to do with the crimes of the Nazis. So here again, I guess you can blame age, naivety, and probably propaganda. And then I think in connection to that, the fact that he also believed in this propaganda as fighting Bolshevism and fighting the right war.
Do you know if his parents had the same opinion about him becoming a soldier?
I would assume so, even though they still had the ties to the movement within the Lutheran church that was actively resisting. So I guess, let's say, clearly they shaped his worldview. So I can't imagine that they were radically opposed. But at the same time, they still had boundaries in the sense that they were following the line of the Free Church, as it was called. So I guess you could say they were playing on 2 different levels at the same time and in a way trying to navigate. Not that it justifies anything, but I think it's an interesting story because it shows that war is not a football game where you have 2 teams and either you win or you lose. It's much more complex.
He was imprisoned in a concentration camp in very young years. Then he was a soldier, probably for several years, and he ended up being a war prisoner in Soviet Union, I think. He experienced quite a lot of imprisonment in his very young years. What do you know about his war prisoner time?
What I know for a fact, because I asked directly, is that he actually preferred, here again, big quotation marks, his time as a war prisoner because he basically felt better treated. He felt he had dignity and that everyone was a comrade. Another thing that was very important for him was the fact that he was actually allowed to practice his religion. So he had a Bible, he could go to church or at least pray on Sundays. So that was very important for him. And he didn't feel as completely lost and cut from his roots as he had been in Sachsenhausen.
Even if he was in the Soviet war prisoners camp, where a lot of war prisoners actually died, he still had the feeling that they still left him some dignity, and that's something he did not feel in Sachsenhausen. That's very interesting.
What he also shared was the fact that it was the first time during that time where he actually realized, I don't know if madness is the right word, but where he basically realized the extent of the wrongness of the Nazi regime and the fall of the regime. So in a way, it was also a breaking point in the sense that he realized the war was lost and what the Nazis had told about, fighting the right war and doing the right thing was wrong and so on. So here again, I guess you could say it was a form of free education, or it was a moment of truth.
Also very interesting that he came to this point in Soviet war prison and not in a concentration camp.
I have no explanation because to me it sounds very irrational, like it's beyond imagination. That's why I'm so attached to the memorial in Sachsenhausen and the museum, because you have to be on the site, see it for yourself to realize the extent. I mean, of course, you hear about it in history books and you learn about it in school, but when you stand there by the entrance of the gas chamber, there's nowhere around. You can't ignore the fact or you can't deny.
After he was released in the Soviet Union, he returned to Germany and he studied theology.
Yes, exactly. So his face was not broken by this experience, quite the contrary. So he started indeed studying theology to become a pastor. And that's what it did for his entire work life, caring for the soul, as it's called in German, spreading the word about the scripture.
Do you know when he started to talk about Sachsenhausen in public? Or like when he actually realized that he is a survivor of something what a lot of people did not survive?
I asked him if he talked about it right after the war or if he got any support, in any type of support, but especially psychological support. And he didn't. He basically just moved on with his life and he repelled it. He denied it. He repressed it, tried to just move on with his life. But one thing he shared with me for the first time when I did a longer interview with him about his experience of the war and so on was that he actually had recurring depressions throughout his life. And what I found very interesting was that the tipping point for him was always in a work context, especially if there was any conflict with his supervisor or his colleague. Maybe I'm projecting now, but I can't help saying connections to his experience, especially the first one in Sachsenhausen, especially because then I went on and asked him, when you were in these depression phases of your life, like what did your inner voice tell you or how did it feel? And he told me, in these moments, I felt like I was an underperson, an Untermensch, which is basically what the Nazis were trying to reach by sending people to concentration camps. I guess it's a fair assumption to say that the experience in Sachsenhausen, but maybe also the rest of the war, even though he fought as a soldier, broke him. And I guess you could say that in a way, religion was his coping mechanism.
Amelie, you got to hear his story from him. He also gave interviews and he did public speaking, and you have some of those interviews. You even shared one with us that he did with the memorial. What questions do you have, though, about him still? Like, what remains unanswered about him, his life, his time in Sachsenhausen, his time after Sachsenhausen, and the effects that it had on him?
Actually, I have more questions about his time as a soldier in the German Nazi army. I'm also curious to hear more about his life after the war and how he dealt with it, especially mentally speaking, because I can imagine it's not the kind of experience you can just place somewhere and then forget. One thing I'm also curious about is hearing more about what he would think about the current world situations, because he passed away in 2021 and when I did this longer interview with him in 2019, the world was different in many ways. What was very interesting for me to see was that he was extremely calm and relaxed. Like he wasn't worried at all about the rise of the far right, or he felt very appeased. I don't know if it's because, he was feeling the end was near and he was kind of ready, or if it's because he really wouldn't have seen it come. But these are the questions I still have.
You had the chance to talk with your grandfather about his experience when you were already an adult yourself. You were able to ask reflected questions. That's something a lot of other descendants couldn't do. Why is the story of your grandfather so important to you? You're involved in a project from the Sachsenhausen Memorial with other descendants. So you're spending your time in a concentration camp. talking about your grandfather, talking about other prisoners of the concentration camp. Why is it so important to you?
That's a big question. I'll try to make it short. There are two dimensions to your question, one individual and one that is more collective. If I start with my own perspective, it's important to me because whether I like it or not, it's part of my own story. It has definitely shaped me in many ways, even though I'm only, a quotation mark, only a third generation, because since my grandfather didn't receive any help to deal with his feeling and his traumatic experience, and his sibling in return, it has shaped the way he raised his own children and the family dynamic, even decades after the war. And so, yeah, I have also been influenced by that and in a way have reproduced some of the patterns. If you don't know the family story, you might not make the connection, but having worked with the whole concept of intergenerational traumas, yeah, it is part of my life and it has shaped me. And so for me, that's all the more reason to investigate this part of my story and try to basically understand better where I'm from. And it's a way to break this cycle, to go back to Sachsenhausen, to learn more about the history, connect with other descendants, and reclaim my story and own the story. And that's something that's quite long, but I feel that I'm on the right track and I'm very proud of that because you have to understand my grandfather had 6 children and all of them have children of their own. So I have a lot of cousins, yet I am the only one who is actually actively working with this story in the sense that, yeah, I am involved in the work of the memorial indirectly. I go there regularly. I try to spread the story of my grandfather as much as I can. So it's also a lonely position to be in. And that's actually a segue into the collective dimension of your answer, because I've realized joining this project about the future of remembrance that there are actually many people with similar experiences. And it was really a game changer for me to connect with them, understand why the things I've experienced in my family are the way they are, and also just realize that I'm not alone. It sounds very mundane, but I think it's quite a powerful human experience to realize, yeah, you're not completely left alone. And there are actually other people who share your experience, especially your struggles. And I think that's also more important than ever, because when you look at this whole idea of never again and, you know, what we can learn from history, if you look at the current state of the world, at best, it's an illusion. At worst, it's a lie. So one thing that I'm hoping to achieve through my own activistic work, if you want to call it that, is to not just raise awareness around remembrance, but really use it as a platform to talk about what happened in the past, reflect upon the kind of society we want to live in, and hopefully create a better future. Because, well, unfortunately, genocides and war didn't stop in 1945. So if we can achieve that by sharing our story and really making the story relatable, and then it will not have been in vain.
You want to understand your struggles. What are your struggles? What are you struggling with?
My grandfather was broken, but his experience in Sachsenhausen and during the war, well, I guess in a way he has dysfunctional patterns in his behaviors. I'm not a psychologist, and you should never diagnose someone without actually having the qualification and let alone talking to the person. But my guess is that he probably had some form of PTSD, which also means that it impacted not just, you know, his way of being, but also his way of interacting with others. And I know from my fathers and some of his siblings that he would hit them and be physically violent and uh, abusive in some ways, not always, of course, but like he wasn't always kind and loving, basically. That has shaped the way I have been raised. I've been raised in a family where you don't talk about things, especially when they are unpleasant or uncomfortable, and especially if they are things as serious as, persecution, war, and so on. But you just ignore them and hope for the best. I can't say the family is particularly close, for instance, and I think that is also partly connected to that experience. Can be tracked back to Sachsenhausen, which is why I'm always insisting on having fun and being happy while I'm there, because I don't want the Nazis to have my pain.
I can relate to what you just said about making sure that when you're there, you find some joy. When we all met back in September of last year, there were, of course, there are moments that are just horrific. I think you mentioned it, like when you're standing in certain places and things just hit you. At the same time, I found joy in meeting with other descendants and knowing that we weren't meant to ever have been alive according to certain people's ideas of who should continue living and not. And then here we all were together in a place that was meant to destroy our ancestors.
I really can recommend to play soccer in Eikevilla.
Fußball, table soccer, right?
Yeah.
And also to have a pizza party.
That's where you see the perversity of this whole system. Like, my brain got stuck on the smallest details when I was there. I remember, for instance, I got completely bananas after I heard, and I'm still banana, about the fact that the guards had a zoo. Like, they had animals as entertainment next to the camp. And I'm just like, who does that? That's also something I'm reflecting a lot upon, especially in these times. I don't think the people back then were necessarily smarter or more stupid than we are. I mean, of course, they had less access to information and less technology compared to what we have, but in principle is what I mean. And it's something I've always been very much aware of, that it doesn't take much, and that it all ultimately, it's all up to us to do the work and make it happen. Because again, when you think about it, my grandfather was just arrested and sent to the concentration camp for sharing a flyer, which is why during the pandemic, when you had some group saying we live in a dictatorship because we're not allowed to demonstrate and so on, it was really, really hard for me to show understanding, because I was like, I understand your frustration, and of course you should be able to raise your voice, but at the same time, think about your wording and your framing.
What other unanswered questions you still have about Sachsenhausen, about your grandfather?
One question I have about Sachsenhausen, and that's been my main question since I joined this project 4 years ago. Who does the future of remembrance look like, and how can we as descendants contribute? How can we defend? I really say defend consciously the memorial, because right now it feels that it's under pressure, if not under attack. And then I'm also always going back to the story of my grandfather, but also just the story of the other people I've got to learn through this project. And I really try to use it as an inspiration for my own life. And one thing I've been thinking about recently was that, of course, when we talk about these stories, we often talk about the pain and the traumatic experience and like the dramatic side of things, so to say. But so basically we take the victim perspective, but I realized recently that you can also turn it upside down and see the resilience, because the learning our grandparents or ancestors taught us is also that you can make it. At least it's a privilege. My grandfather made it and was able to continue his life. Of course, not everyone was that lucky, but for those who survived, I find incredibly much inspiration in their strength and resilience, because one thing is that they made it, but they also rebuilt the whole continent and almost the whole world. They, they somehow managed to be happy. And yeah, I think a lot about this right now, because it's give me strength to focus not just on the day tomorrow and getting through the day and being in survival mode and trying to defend and stand up for what I believe in, but think about the day after tomorrow, because that's actually the day worth living for. And when that day comes, then you need to be ready, because clearly it's also a place where you hopefully get a chance to build a society that's different and better. So I just hope it won't take a third world war to get there.
I'm really glad to be working with you. I'm really glad to have met you. Our stories are so different in the circumstances, but they're so similar in the outcome. There were things that you were talking about throughout this whole dialogue that I was getting goosebumps. I think I teared up a few times. Some of the things that you were saying really touched me, and that I can really understand and relate to, because I see it the same way. I'd say, like, the idea of what we carry with us. I realize now as an adult that I didn't know that we carried. I didn't know my mom carried. I didn't know my family was carrying, because my grandmother did the same as your grandfather in what you said about, like, kind of hardening off to repressing what happened and saying, I have a different life now. My life now is good. So without addressing the idea of being broken or having had experienced that trauma, but trying to continue on with that life, there are things that happen and that come through. It took meeting all of you, other descendants at Sachsenhausen, to really see it. So I appreciate that you shared that.
One of the first thing I looked up after, I started being part of this project was trying to find statistics about the descendants, because we know approximately how many victims there were, but I only found estimates of the descendant of, Jewish Holocaust survivors in the US, which is, first of all, an estimation, and second of all, quite limited. But what I'm getting at that point is that I think we are much more numerous than we think we are. And I guess the key is to find each other and connect, because, it's one of these experiences that you can only truly understand if you've been there yourself.
I do want to ask you, one final question from me is if you have any questions that you would ask other descendants.
So generally speaking, I'm always super curious to hear the stories, because I think it makes a whole difference to hear about personal fates. And I agree with you, even though every story is unique, at the same time, you always find common characteristic. But I guess one of the questions I would be interested in asking would be about how they see the future of remembrance, and which responsibility they think we have or do not have, if they feel that they have a role to play in that process, or if it should be something that is kept private, or if it's more the work of historian. And I'm also curious about, how memory is kept alive in families, because I can imagine it's quite different depending on what happened with your ancestors, how it's been dealt with in the family. So I'm always curious about rituals for incense or traditions, and also how people, especially the people from, let's say, the third and fourth generation and onwards, well, maintain this memory, share it with their children when they come of age. Because one thing I'm also extremely aware of is that being 31, I'm the last generation who has actually had the opportunity to hear this firsthand accounts. And that's something I find extremely frightening and something, I see it as a responsibility. And that's why I continue doing this work with the collective, because I fear that if we do not take charge, no one else will do the job.
Thank you so much for taking the time to talk with us today and share more about your story and your family.
Sachsenhausen, błogosławiony raju, wszak wielbi Ciebie ludzkość, Heil, Sachsenhausen. A jak będę jutro wzdychał lewą nóżką, ci zawnikam. Heil, es lebe Kulturkampf.